Before the United States became a superpower, they were just 13 colonies, oppressed, divided, and surrounded by the greatest empire in the world. But in the face of injustice and repression, one word echoed: freedom. This is the story of how ordinary people dared to defy a king and change the fate of the world. Even before the first shot was fired, the American War of Independence was already being fought through words, papers, and protests. In the 18th century, the 13 British colonies in North America were thriving. But despite their prosperity, they were ruled from afar by a crown that imposed increasingly heavy taxes, without giving the colonists a voice in the decisions. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," echoed through the streets. It was the outcry against taxes imposed by the British Parliament, like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act. In Boston, groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged, organizing boycotts, pamphlets, and acts of resistance. Tensions were rising, and the powder keg was about to blow. In 1773, the rebellion took shape in one of the most symbolic acts in history, the Boston Tea Party. Colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and dumped tons of tea into the harbor. For the British, it was vandalism. For the colonists, it was a cry for freedom. In response, the British government imposed the Intolerable Acts. It closed the port of Boston, dissolved local assemblies, and sent troops to control the population. But the crackdown had the opposite effect. It brought the colonies even closer together. In 1774, they formed the First Continental Congress. The goal? To resist, and if necessary, to fight. The war had not yet begun, but the path to it was already set. Each new decree, each act of repression, each fiery speech, all led to a single destination: confrontation. The colonies didn't just want to protest, they wanted to be free. On the early morning of April 19, 1775, British troops marched toward the villages of Lexington and Concord. Their goal: seize hidden weapons and arrest colonial leaders. But the militiamen were warned. Paul Revere, riding through the night, had spread the word: the British are coming. In Lexington, about 70 colonists faced nearly 700 British soldiers. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it changed everything. It was the beginning of war. 7 Americans were killed. The British advanced to Concord, but met heavy resistance and were forced to retreat. During the retreat, militiamen from nearby towns surrounded the roads. They attacked and vanished into the trees, using guerrilla tactics. By the end of the day, over 250 British soldiers were dead or wounded. The war had begun, and the colonists had made their stand. After the first clashes at Lexington and Concord, colonial leaders knew it was time to act like a nation. In June 1775, gathered at the Second Continental Congress, they made a historic decision: to form an army and appoint a commander. The man chosen was George Washington, a Virginia farmer and veteran of the French and Indian War. Washington took command of the newly formed Continental Army in Boston, where colonists were besieging the British. With no trained troops, little ammunition, and barely any experience, Washington knew the war would be long, but he was ready to fight for every inch of freedom. The war for independence had truly begun. An improvised army, led by a determined commander, now faced the world's greatest empire. The fate of the colonies rested on courage, endurance, and the hope of a people who dreamed of freedom. Amid the war, colonial leaders realized that resisting wasn't enough. They needed to make it clear they no longer wanted to be part of the British Empire. In the summer of 1776, Congress appointed a committee to write a document that would change history. Thomas Jefferson, just 33 years old, was the main author. On July 4th, the text was approved. In it, the United States declared its right to liberty and self-determination. It was more than a political break. It was a declaration of principles. The document was read in public squares, printed in newspapers, and spread across the colonies. For the first time, the world heard the name of a new nation, the United States of America. There was no turning back. Freedom was now written and would be defended with blood. In 1777, the British tried to divide the colonies by moving south from Canada. But in Saratoga, New York, they were met with fierce resistance. Led by Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, the American forces surrounded and defeated the British in one of the most decisive battles of the war. The victory at Saratoga changed everything. Until then, European powers watched the war with hesitation. But now, France saw an opportunity. In 1778, the French signed an alliance with the United States, sending ships, soldiers, and weapons into the fight. With France's support, the United States gained new strength. What once seemed like an uneven fight was now becoming a global conflict, and the British Empire, used to winning, was starting to feel the weight of resistance. During the winter of 1777 to 1778, the Continental Army settled in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. There were no battles at that moment, but the fight was against cold, hunger, and disease. Soldiers with no boots, wrapped in rags, endured freezing temperatures in makeshift cabins. It was a turning point. Many considered giving up. But under George Washington's leadership, and with the help of the Prussian Baron von Steuben, the soldiers were trained, reorganized, and turned into a stronger, more disciplined army. Valley Forge wasn't a military victory, but it was a moral one. Those who survived that winter came out more prepared and more determined. The flame of freedom didn't fade. It endured even under the snow. Not all threats to the revolution came from the battlefield. In 1780, the Americans were shaken by a shocking betrayal. Benedict Arnold, hero of the Battle of Saratoga, had switched sides. Disillusioned with Congress and tempted by money and prestige, he plotted to hand over the West Point fort to the British. The plot was uncovered only because British spy John Andre was captured carrying secret documents. Arnold escaped, but his name became forever linked to treason. The war wasn't fought only with bullets, but with information and deception. While armies clashed in the field, an invisible war unfolded in the shadows. Spies, coded messages, and false allies were everywhere. Winning the war required more than strength. It required intelligence. In 1781, British General Cornwallis positioned his army in Yorktown, Virginia. It was a strategic move, but it would become a trap. George Washington, with crucial support from French troops under Rochambeau and the Navy led by de Grasse, surrounded the city by land and blocked the sea. For days, artillery bombarded the British positions. With no reinforcements, no escape routes, and exhausted troops, Cornwallis had no choice. On October 19, 1781, he officially surrendered. The cannons fell silent, and the war in practice was over. The Battle of Yorktown was the final blow. After years of resistance, loss, and sacrifice, the United States had proven they could defeat an empire. Freedom was now real and irreversible. Even after the British surrender at Yorktown, it took 2 more years of negotiation to finalize peace. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. A new country emerged on the map, born from war and built upon the idea of freedom. The end of the war was only the beginning. The United States still had to define itself as a nation, face internal challenges, and write its own constitution. But in that treaty, the first great modern democracy of the world was officially born. The American War of Independence was more than a fight between an army and an empire. It was the beginning of an idea that people can choose their own destiny, an idea that, to this day, continues to inspire the world.